egos. Number four, that the opposite poles of relationships, such as light and darkness, solid and space, are in actual conflict, which may result in the permanent victory of one of the poles. We are certainly in the belief that left and right, black and white, one of them is constantly winning, and they have nothing to do with one another. They're polar opposites, when in fact, Watts would say they are the same. They are the head tailed cat, as he discussed. That number five, that death is evil and that life must be a constant war against it. Number six, that man, individually and collectively, should aspire to be top species and put himself in control of nature. That's what we believe this life is, the controlling of nature, man versus nature. We're controlling nature, bending it to our will, and in doing so, we're destroying the whole planet. Fictions are useful so long as they are taken as fictions. They are then simply ways of figuring the world, which we agree to follow so that we can act in cooperation, as we agree about inches and hours, numbers and words, mathematical systems and languages. If we have no agreement about measures of time and space, I have no way of making a date with you at the corner of 42nd Street and 5th Avenue at 3 p.m. on Sunday 4. Sunday, April 4, that is. It's so funny he mentions that because I know the actual. I've stood at 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. It's right near the library, and there's a light to cross the street there in order to walk to the subway, and I never catch it. It's always red. I always have to stand there and wait, and every time I think of Alan Watts. It's him. That rascal is playing games with me beyond the grave. But the troubles begin when the fictions are taken as facts. Thus, in 1752, the British government instituted a calendar reform which required that September 2 of that year be dated September 14, with the result that many people imagined that 11 days had been taken off of their lives and rushed to Westminster screaming, "Give us back our 11 days." The confusions of fact and fiction make it all the more difficult to find wider acceptance of common laws, languages, measures, and other useful institutions, and to improve those already employed. But as we have seen, the deeper troubles arise when we confuse ourselves and our fundamental relationships to the world with fictions or figures of thought, which are taken for granted, unexamined, and often self contradictory. Here, as we have also seen, the nub problem is a self contradictory definition of man himself as a separate and independent being in the world, as distinct from a special action of the world. Part of our difficulty is that the latter view of man seems to make him no more than a puppet. But this is because, in trying to accept or understand the latter view, we are still in the grip of the former. To say that man is an action of the world is not to define him as a thing, which is helplessly pushed around by all other things. We have to get beyond Newton's vision of the world as a system of billiard balls in which every individual is passively knocked about by all the rest. Remember that Aristotle and Newton's preoccupation with casual determinism was that they were trying to explain how one thing or event was influenced by others, forgetting that the division of the world into separate things and events was a fiction. To say that certain events are causally connected is only a clumsy way of saying that they are features of the same event, like the head and the tail of a cat. It is essential to understand this point thoroughly, that the thing in itself, Kant's Ding an sich, I'm not German, my apologies to Angela Merkel, whether animal, vegetable, or mineral, is not only unknowable, it does not exist. This is important not only for sanity and peace of mind, but also for the most practical reasons of economics, politics, and technology. Our practical projects have run into confusion again and again through failure to see that individual people, nations, animals, insects, and plants do not exist in or by themselves. This is not to say only that things exist in relation to one another, but that what we call things are no more than glimpses of a unified process. Certainly, this process has distinct features which catch our attention, but we must remember that distinction is not separation. I love that point from Watts. You know, the heart and the lungs don't look anything like one another, but you very much need them both to work in harmony. Distinction is not separation. Sharp and clear as the crest of the wave may be, it necessarily goes with the smooth and less featured curve of the trough. So also the bright points of the stars go with, if I may not count a word, the dark background of space. In the Gestalt, whoa, excuse me. In the Gestalt theory of perception, this is known as the figure ground relationship. This theory asserts, in brief, that no figure is ever perceived except in relation to a background. If, for example, you come so close to me that the outline of my body lies beyond your field of vision, the thing you will see will no longer be my body. Your attention will instead be captured by a coat button or a necktie. For the theory also asserts that, against any given background, our attention is almost automatically won by any moving shape, in contrast with the stationary background, or by any enclosed or tightly complex feature, in contrast with the simpler and featureless background. Thus, when I draw the following figure on a blackboard, a big giant circle, and ask, "What have I drawn?" people will generally identify it as a circle, as I just did, a ball, a disc, or a ring. Only rarely will someone reply, "A wall with a hole in it." In other words, we are not easily notice that all features of the world hold their boundaries in common with the areas that surround them, that the outline of the figure is also the inline of the background. Let us suppose that my circle slash hole figure were to move through the following series of shapes. Here, what appears to me to be one circle sort of dividing into two. Most people would thereupon ascribe the movement, the act, to the enclosed area as if it were an amoeba. But I might just have well been drawing the dry patches in a thin film of water spread over a polished table. So the point is that in either case, the movement of any feature of the world cannot be ascribed to the outside alone or to the inside alone. Both move together. Our difficulty in noticing both the presence and the action of the background in these simple illustrations is immensely increased when it comes to the behavior of living organisms. When we watch ants scurrying hither and thither over a patch of sand, or people milling around in a public square, it seems absolutely undeniable that the ants and the people are alone responsible for this movement. Yet, in fact, this is only a highly complex version of the simple problem of the three balls moving in space. That's a cut back to chapter 1, where he's talking about if you only have two balls, if this one's moving, if the left one is moving, is it really moving or is the right one moving? It's difficult to tell until you have three-dimensional space, which of course is the meat bodies that we live in. Yet, in this fact, is only a highly complex version of the simple problem of the three balls moving in space, in which we had to settle for the solution that the entire configuration, the gestalt, is moving. Not the balls alone, not the space alone, not even the balls and the space together in concert, but rather a single field of solid space of which the balls and space are, as it were, poles. The illusion that organisms move entirely on their own is immensely persuasive until we settle down, as scientists do, to describe their behavior carefully. Then the scientist, be he biologist, sociologist, or physicist, finds very rapidly that he cannot say what the organism is doing unless at the same time he describes the behavior of its surroundings. Obviously, an organism cannot be described as walking just in terms of leg motion, for the direction and speed of this walking must be described in terms of the ground upon which it moves. Furthermore, this walking is seldom haphazard. It has something to do with food sources in the area, with the hostile or friendly behavior of other organisms. If you're being chased by a tiger, you tend to run pretty fast, and countless other factors which we do not immediately consider when attention is first drawn to a prowling ant. The more detailed the description of our ant's behavior becomes, the more it has to include such matters as density, humidity, and temperature of the surrounding atmosphere, the types and sources of its food, the social structure of its own species, and that of neighboring species with which it has some symbiotic or preying relationship. Again, when you're being chased by a tiger, it's preying upon you. You're in a relationship with the tiger. Um, it's certainly not symbiotic. In the grand scheme of things, maybe, but not in that moment. When at last the whole vast list is compiled and the scientist calls finish for lack of further time or interest, he may well have found the impression that the ant's behavior is no more than its automatic and involuntary reaction to its environment. It is attracted by this, repelled by that, kept alive by one condition, and destroyed by another. But let us suppose that he turns his attention to some other organism in the ant's neighborhood, perhaps a housewife with a greasy kitchen. He will soon have to include that ant and all its friends and relations as something which determines her behavior. Wherever he turns his attention, he finds, instead of some positive causal agent, a merely responsive hollow whose boundaries go this way and that according to outside pressures. Yet, on second thought, this won't do. What does it mean, he asks himself, that a description of what the ant is doing must include what its environment is doing? It means that the thing or entity he is studying and describing has changed. It started out to be the individual ant, but it very quickly became the whole field of activities in which the ant is found. The same thing would happen if one started out to describe a particular organ of the body. Distinction is not separation. It would be utterly unintelligible unless one took into account its relationship with other organs. It is thus that every scientific discipline for the study of living organisms, bacteriology, botany, zoology, biology, anthropology, must, from its own special standpoint, develop a science of ecology, literally, the logic of the household, or the study of organism and environment fields. Unfortunately, this science runs afoul of academic politics, being much too interdisciplinary for the jealous guardians of departmental boundaries. But the neglect of ecology is the one most serious weakness of modern technology, and it goes hand in hand with our reluctance to be participating members of the whole community of living species. Man aspires to govern nature, but the more one studies ecology, the more absurd it seems to speak of any one feature of any organism or of an organism environment field as governing or ruling others. Once upon a time, the mouth, the hands, and the feet said to each other, we do all this work gathering food and chewing it up, but that lazy fellow, the stomach, he doesn't do anything. It's high time he did some work too, okay? We're going on strike. First off, I'm a big fan of that. Whereupon they went many days without working. But they soon found themselves feeling weaker and weaker until at last each of them realized that the stomach was their stomach and that they would have to go back to work to remain alive. But even in physiological textbooks, we speak of the brain or of the nervous system as governing the heart or the digestive tract, smuggling bad politics into science as if the heart belonged to the brain rather than the brain to the heart or the stomach. Yet it is as true or false to say that the brain through uh, feeds itself through the stomach, as that the stomach evolves a brain as its upper entrance to get more food. Again, all these things connected and interdependent at every level of the universe. As soon as one sees that separate things are fictitious, it becomes obvious that non existent things cannot perform actions. The difficulty is that most languages are arranged so that actions, verbs, we were just talking about this on Sunday too. Mike was saying he was reading that book about Native American, the Algonquin, I believe, who they think of themselves not necessarily as nouns but as verbs and actions with as whirlpools, as Watts says as well. The difficulty is that most languages are arranged so that actions, verbs, have to be set in motion by things, nouns, and we forget that rules of grammar are not necessarily rules or patterns of nature. Again, the world is very wiggly and we draw a grid over it. But the grid is not the world, the wiggliness is the world. This, which is nothing more than a convention of grammar, is also responsible for, or better, goes with, there's that word, absurd puzzles as to how spirit governs matter or mind moves body. How can a noun, which is by definition not action, lead to action? Scientists would be less embarrassed if they used a language on the model of the Amerindian Nootka. Here we go. Come on, synchronicity. Consisting of verbs and adverbs and leaving off nouns and adjectives. If we can speak of a house as housing, a mat as matting, or of a couch as seating, why can't we think of people as peopling, or brains as braining, or of an ant as anting? Thus, in the Nootka language, a church is housing religiously, a shop is housing tradingly, and a home is housing homely. Yet we are habituated to ask who or what is housing, who peoples, what is it that ants? Yet isn't it obvious that when we say the lightning flashed, the flashing is the same as the lightning, and that it would be enough to say there was lightning? Everything labeled with a noun is demonstrably a process or action, but language is full of spooks like it and it is raining, which are supposed causes of action. But does it really explain running to say that a man is running? On the contrary, the only explanation would be a description of the field or situation in which a manning goes with a running, as distinct from one in which a manning goes with sitting. Parentheses, Watts says, I'm not recommending this primitive and clumsy form of verb language for general and normal use. We should have to contrive something much more elegant. Furthermore, running is not something other than myself, which I, the organism, do. For the organism is sometimes a running process, sometimes a standing process, sometimes a sleeping process, and so on. And in each instance, the cause of the behavior is the situation as a whole, the organism slash environment. Indeed, it would be best to drop the idea of causality and use instead the idea of relativity. For it is still inexact to say that an organism responds or reacts to a given situation by running or standing or whatever. This is still the language of Newtonian billiards. It's easier to think of situations as moving patterns like organisms themselves. Thus, to go back to the cat or catting, a situation with pointed ears and whiskers at one end does not have a tail at the other end as a response or reaction to the whiskers or the claws of the fur. As the Chinese say, the various features of a situation arise mutually or imply one another as back implies front and as chickens imply eggs and vice versa. They exist in relation to each other like the poles of a magnet, only more complexly patterned. Moreover, as the egg chicken relationship exists, not all the features of a total situation have to appear at the same time. The existence of a man implies parents, even though they may be long since dead, and the birth of an organism implies its death. Wouldn't it be as far fetched to call birth the cause of death as to call the cat's head the cause of the tail? Lifting the neck of a bottle implies lifting the bottom as well, for the two parts come up at the same time. If I pick up an accordion by one end, the other will follow a little later, but the principle is the same. Total situations are therefore patterns in time as much as patterns in space. And right now is the moment to say that I am not trying to smuggle in the total situation as a new disguise for old things which were supposed to explain behavior or action. The total situation or field is always open ended, for little fields have big fields upon their backs to bite them, and big fields have bigger fields, and so ad infinitum. I'm not sure where Watts is getting these little like inset poems, but they are adorable. I gotta say, he's a rascal. This Watts. He's messing with me at 42nd and 5th. I'll tell you that much. We can never describe all the features of the total situation, not only because every situation is infinitely complex, but also because the total situation is the universe. Fortunately, we do not have to describe any situation exhaustively because some of its features appear to be much more important than others for understanding the behavior of the various organisms within it. We never get more than a sketch of the situation, yet this is enough to show that actions or processes must be understood or explained in terms of situations, just as words must be understood in the context of sentences, paragraphs, chapters, books, libraries, and life itself. Again, he's mentioning here that we draw the grid over the wiggliness of the world so that we have some point of reference so that we're not constantly living in complete chaos. But we get obsessed with the grid and we lose sight of the actual reality of the wiggliness and truly the connectedness of all of these things. To sum up, just as no thing or organism exists on its own, it does not act on its own. Furthermore, every organism is a process. Thus, the organism is not other than its actions. To put it clumsily, it is what it does. More precisely, the organism, including its behavior, is a process which is to be understood only in relation to the larger and longer process of its environment. For what we mean by understanding or comprehension is seeing how parts fit into a whole, and then realizing that they don't compose the whole as one assembles a jigsaw puzzle, but that the whole is a pattern, a complex wiggliness which has no separate parts. Parts are fictions of language, of the calculus of looking at the world through a net which seems to chop it into bits. Parts exist only for purposes of figuring and describing, and as we figure the world out, we become confused if we do not remember this all the time. Once this is clear, we have shattered the myth of the fully automatic universe, where human consciousness and intelligence are a fluke in the midst of boundless stupidity. Which, again, that's a very kind of like hard science, atheistic way to look at the world, which I am fond of saying is just less fun. But Watts is saying it's incorrect here based on Vedanta Hinduism and all sorts of other things, ancient teachings. And quantum physics may well catch up to this too. For if the behavior of an organism is intelligible only in relation to its environment, intelligent behavior implies an intelligent environment. Obviously, if parts do not really exist, it makes no sense to speak of an intelligent part of an unintelligent whole. It is easy enough to see that an intelligent human being implies an intelligent human society. You could question that. For thinking is a social activity, a mutual interchange of messages and ideas based on such social institutions as languages, sciences, libraries, universities, and museums. I take it back. He's right. It's an intelligent society. Humans are incredibly intelligent. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. But what about the non human environment in which the human society flourishes? Ecologists often speak of the evolution of environments over and above the evolution of organisms. For man did not appear on Earth until the Earth itself, together with all its biological forms, had evolved to a certain degree of balance and complexity. At this point of evolution, the Earth implied man, just as the existence of man implies a sort of a planet at that stage of evolution. The balance of nature, the harmony of contained conflicts, I love that turn of phrase, in which man thrives, is a network of mutually interdependent organisms of the most astounding subtlety and complexity. Teilhard de Chardin, my apologies to Mr. Macron, I'm not a Frenchman, has called it the biosphere, the film of living organisms which covers the original geosphere, the mineral planet. Lack of knowledge about the evolution of the organic from the inorganic, coupled with misleading myths about life coming into this world from somewhere outside, has made it difficult for us to see that the biosphere arises or goes with a certain degree of geological and astronomical evolution. But as Douglas E. Harding has pointed out, we tend to think of this planet as a life infested rock, which is as absurd as thinking of the human body as a cell infested skeleton. Surely all forms of life, including man, must be understood as symptoms of the Earth, the solar system, and the galaxy, in which case we cannot escape the conclusion that the galaxy is intelligent. If I first see a tree in the winter, I might assume that it is not a fruit tree. But when I return in the summer to find it covered in plums, I must exclaim, "Excuse me, you were a freaking fruit tree after all." Imagine then that a billion years ago, some beings from another part of the galaxy made a tour through the solar system in their flying saucer and found no life. They would dismiss it as, just a bunch of old rocks. But if they returned today, they would have to apologize. Well, you were peopling rocks after all. You may, of course, argue that there is no analogy between the two situations. The fruit tree was at one time a seed inside the plum, but the Earth, much less the solar system or the whole galaxy, was never a seed inside a person. But oddly enough, you would be wrong. I have tried to explain that the relation between an organism and its environment is mutual, that neither one is the cause or determinant of the other, since the arrangement between them is polar. And this is a basic scientific concept too of the ecosystem. The cows eat the grass, we eat the cows. That this contained conflicts. in harmony. If then it makes sense to explain the organism and its behavior in terms of the environment, it will also make sense to explain the environment in terms of the organism. Thus far, I've kept this up my sleeve so as not to confuse the first aspect of the picture. For there is a very real physical sense in which man and every other organism creates his own environment. Our whole knowledge of the world is, in one sense, self knowledge. For knowing is a translation of external events into bodily processes, and especially into states of the nervous system and the brain. We know the world in terms of the body and in accordance with its structure. Surgical alterations of the nervous system, or in all probability, sense organs of a different structure than ours, give different types of perception, just as the microscope and the telescope change the vision of the naked eye. Bees and other insects have, for example, Polaroid eyes, which enable them to tell the position of the sun by observing any patch of blue sky. In other words, because of the different structure of their eyes, the sky that they see is not the sky that we see. Bats and homing pigeons have sensory equipment analogous to radar, and in this respect, see more reality than we do without our special instruments. And from the viewpoint of your eyes, your own head seems to be an invisible blank, neither dark nor light, standing immediately behind the nearest thing you can see. But in fact, the whole field of vision out there in front is a sensation in the lower back of your head where the optical centers of the brain are located. What you see out there is immediately how the inside of your head looks or feels. So, too, everything that you hear, touch, taste, and smell is some kind of vibration interacting with your brain, which translates that vibration into what you know as light, color, sound, hardness, roughness, saltiness, heaviness, or pungence. Apart from your brain, all these vibrations would be like the sound of one hand clapping or of sticks playing on a skinless drum. As a little Zen reference, a Zen koan, a question without an answer to make your brain kind of freak out. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Apart from your brain, or some brain, the world is devoid of light, heat, weight, solidity, motion, space, time, or any other imaginable feature. All these phenomena are interactions or transactions of vibrations with a certain arrangement of neurons. Thus, vibrations of light and heat from the sun do not actually become light or heat until they interact with a living organism, just as no light beams are visible in space unless reflected by particles of atmosphere or dust. In other words, it takes two to make a thing go right, to make anything happen. It may do to make it bad as that. As we saw, a single ball in space has no motion, whereas two balls gave the possibility of linear motion, three balls motion in a plane, and four balls motion in three dimensions. The same is true for the activation of an electric current. No current will flow through a wire until the positive pole is connected with a negative. Or, to put it very simply, no current will start unless it has a point of arrival. And a living organism is a point of arrival, apart from which there can never be the currents or phenomena of light, heat, weight, hardness, and so forth. One might almost say that the magic of the brain is to evoke these marvels from the universe as a harpist evokes melody from the silent strings. A still more cogent example of existence as a relationship is the production of a rainbow. For a rainbow appears only when there is a certain triangular relationship between three components: the sun, moisture in the atmosphere, and an observer. If all three are present, and if the angular relationship between them is correct, then and only then will there be the phenomenon rainbow. Diaphanous as it may be, a rainbow is no subjective hallucination. It can be verified by any number of observers, though each will see it in a slightly different position. As a boy, I once chased the end of a rainbow on my bicycle and was amazed to find that it always receded. It was like trying to catch the reflection of the moon on water. I did not then understand that no rainbow would appear unless the sun and I and the invisible center of the bow were on the same straight line, so that I changed the apparent position of the bow as I moved. And not for nothing, but the image of a little 10-year-old Alan Watts on a bicycle chasing after himself, chasing after a rainbow, is adorable. The point is, then, that an observer in the proper position is as necessary for the manifestation of a rainbow as the other two components, the sun and the moisture. Of course, one could say that if the sun and a body of moisture were in the right relationship, say over the ocean, any observer on a ship that sailed into line with them would see a rainbow. But one could also say that if an observer and the sun were correctly aligned, there would be a rainbow if there were moisture in the air. Again, these contain conflicts in harmony. They require one another. They're not butting heads against one another. They need each other. It's so beautiful. Somehow, the first set of conditions seem to preserve the reality of the rainbow apart from the observer. But the second set, by eliminating a good solid external reality, seems to make it an indisputable fact that, under such conditions, there is no rainbow. The reason is only that it supports our current mythology to assert that things exist on their own, whether there is an observer or not. It supports the fantasy that man is not really involved in the world, that he makes no real difference to it, and that he can observe reality independently without changing it. For the myth of this solid and sensible physical world, which is there, whether we see it or not, goes hand in hand with the myth that every observer is a separate ego confronted with a reality quite other than himself. Perhaps we can accept this reasoning without too much struggle when it concerns things like rainbows and reflections, whose reality status, was never too high to begin with. But what if it dawns on us that our perception of rocks, mountains, and stars is a situation of just the same kind? There is nothing in the least unreasonable about this. We have not had to drag in any special spooks as mind, soul, or spirit. We've simply been talking of an interaction between physical vibrations and the brain with its various organs of sense, saying only that creatures with brains are an integral feature of the pattern, which also includes the solid earth and the stars, and that without this integral feature, or the pole of the current, the whole cosmos would be as manifested as unmanifested as a rainbow without droplets in the sky or without an observer. This ancient question of, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's around to hear it, doesn't make a noise. I don't know. You can't actually know that. But what Watts is saying is, if you are there, it makes a noise, and those three things, the tree, the environment, and you, experience this thing together. But you need each other in order for it to actually happen. Our resistance to this reasoning is psychological. It makes us feel insecure because it unsettles a familiar image of the world in which rocks, above all, are symbols of hard, unshakable reality, and the eternal rock a metaphor for God Himself. The mythology of the 19th century led reduced man to an utterly unimportant little germ in an unimaginably vast and enduring universe. It is just too much of a shock, too fast a switch, to recognize that this little germ with its fabulous brain is evoking the whole thing, including the nebulae millions of light years away. Does this force us to the highly implausible conclusion that before the first living organism came into being, equipped with a brain, there was no universe? That the organic and inorganic phenomena came into existence at the same temporal moment? Is it possible that all geological and astronomical history is a mere extrapolation? That it is talking about what would have happened if it had been observed? Perhaps. But I will venture a more cautious idea. The fact that every organism evokes its own environment must be corrected with the polar opposite fact that the total environment evokes the organism. Furthermore, the total environment or situation is both spatial and temporal, both larger and longer than the organisms contained in its field. The organism evokes knowledge of a past before it began and of a future beyond its death. At the other pole, the universe would not have started or manifested itself unless it was at some time going to include organisms, just as current will not begin to flow from the positive end of a wire until the negative terminal is secure. The principle is the same, whether it takes the universe billions of years to polarize itself in the organism, or whether it takes the current 1 second to traverse a wire 186,000 miles long. 18600? I'm not a math guy, folks. I repeat that the difficulty of understanding the organism and environment polarity is psychological. The history and the geographical distribution of the myth are uncertain, but for several thousand years we have been obsessed with a false humility. On the one hand, putting ourselves down as mere creatures who came into this world by the whim of God or the fluke of blind forces. And on the other, conceiving ourselves as separate personal egos fighting to control the physical world. We have lacked the real humility of recognizing that we are members of the biosphere, the harmony of contained conflicts in which we cannot exist at all without the cooperation of plants, insects, fish, cattle, and bacteria. In the same measure, we have lacked the proper self respect of recognizing that I, the individual organism, am a structure of such fabulous ingenuity that it calls the whole universe into being. I mean, that's pretty cool. In the act of putting everything at a distance so as to describe and control it, we have orphaned ourselves both from the surrounding world and from our own bodies, leaving I as a disconnected and alienated spook anxiously and guilty and unrelated and alone. We have attained a view of the world in a type of sanity which is dried out like a rusty beer can on the beach. It is a world of objects, of nothing buts, as ordinary as a formica table with chromium fittings. We find it immensely reassuring, except that it won't stay put, and must therefore be defended even at the cost of scouring the whole planet back to a nice clean rock, and we are rocketing towards that. For life is, after all, a rather messy and gooey accident in our basically geological universe. If a man's son asks for bread, will he give him a stone? The answer is probably yes. I think that's a joke from 1966 that doesn't necessarily translate. If you understood it, I'm happy for you. Yet, this is no quarrel with scientific thinking, which, as of this date, has gone far, far beyond Newtonian billiards and the myth of the fully automatic mechanical universe of mere objects. That was where science really got its start. But in accordance with William Blake's principle that the fool who persists in his folly will become wise, the persistent scientist is the first to realize the obsolescence of old models of the world. Open a good standard textbook on quantum theory. Here we go, folks. This is the juicy stuff. The world cannot be analyzed correctly into distinct parts. This is Watts using ancient teachings 10,000 years old to now meet it with quantum theory, which is the newest science that there is. Still, the world cannot be analyzed correctly into distinct parts. Instead, it must be regarded as an indivisible unit in which separate parts appear as valid approximations only in the classical, i.e., Newtonian, limit. Thus, at the quantum level of accuracy, an object does not have any intrinsic properties, for instance, wave or particle, belonging to itself alone. Instead, it shares all its properties mutually and indivisibly with the systems with which it interacts. Moreover, because a given object, such as an electron, interacts at different times with different systems that bring out different potentialities, it undergoes continual transformation between the various forms, for instance, wave or particle form, in which it can manifest itself. Although such fluidity and dependence of form on the environment have not been found, before the advent of quantum theory at the level of elementary particles in physics, they are not uncommon in fields such as biology, which deal with complex systems. Thus, under suitable environmental conditions, a bacterium can develop into a spore stage, which is completely different in structure and vice versa. Back to Watts. Then there is the other complementary side of the picture as presented by the eminent biophysicist Erwin Schrödinger. And you might know Schrödinger's cat as a classic quantum theory quandary. It is not possible that this unity of knowledge, feeling, and choice, which you call your own, should have sprung into being from nothingness at a given moment not so long ago. Rather, this knowledge, feeling, and choice are essentially eternal and unchangeable and numerically one in all men, nay, in all sensitive beings. But not in this sense that you are a part, a piece of an eternal, infinite being, an aspect or modification of it, as in Spinoza's pantheism. For we should have the same baffling question: which part, which aspect are you? What objectively differentiates it from the others? No, But inconceivable as it seems to an ordinary reason, you and all other conscious beings as such are all in all. Hence, this life of yours, which you are living, is not merely a piece of it, it's not merely a piece of the entire existence, but is in a certain sense the whole. Only this whole is not so constituted that it can be surveyed in one single glance. Again, it's like the whole world is standing too close to us. So we're only focused on the coat button when in fact it's, a big giant thing. The universe implies the organism, and each single organism implies the universe. Only the single glance of our spotlight, narrowed attention, which has been taught to confuse its glimpses with separate things, must somehow be open to the full vision which Schrödinger goes on to suggest. Thus, you can throw yourself flat on the ground, stretched out upon Mother Earth, with the certain conviction that you are one with her and she with you. You are as firmly established, as invulnerable as she, indeed 1,000 times firmer and more invulnerable. As surely as she will engulf you tomorrow, so surely she will bring you forth anew to striving and suffering. And not merely someday, now, today. Every day she is bringing you forth not once, but thousands upon thousands of times, just as every day she engulfs you 1,000 times over. For eternally and always there is always now, one and the same now. The present is the only thing that has no end. And speaking of ends, that is the conclusion of chapter 4. Now, this one got a little spacey and out there, but this is something Mike and I have talked about on the show before. In fact, I brought up the example of ants. And so, like I had mentioned, it's a basic scientific principle that an ecosystem, little things get eaten by bigger things and bigger things, and the bear is at the top of the food chain or what have you. So these things are, and there are, classic scientific examples where they're trying to like get rid of an invasive species. So they introduce something, but of course they didn't do it properly or whatever. And then it wipes out the whole ecosystem or like dramatically changes it, because these things are so interdependent. And the one implies the other. Like the environment allows for the organism, but the organism also demands the environment. So there's those two things, and then we really got into the quantum realm, which is really interesting and very confusing. I understand so little of it, but what he's kind of talking about there is just that it's interesting because even I talk about on the show all the time, like, well, the God or the universe or the source, the oneness, it all. Well, we are just one tiny piece of it, which Watts is saying here, well, that's not actually the proper way to think of it, because we are all of it at all times, because our environments demand us and we demand our environments. How that is beneficial in a moment to moment, day to day basis, I think allows for, it would at least, I think, I'll only speak for myself personally. It eases the idea that it's a giant mistake that we're all here, because we are all. And of course we are here because for the mere fact that we are. And so when you feel lonely, out of the way, everything's going wrong, everything's a big giant mistake. Oh my gosh, I have to do this and this and this and this. Well, that worrying is part of the pleasure and pain, the yin and the yang of the universe. But even that is still fundamented in the allness, the hide and seek game that the universe is playing with itself, which is really something else. So that's wrapping up chapter 4. I think chapter 5 gets really juicy. I think there's like 6 or 7 chapters. Again, you can always go to Linktree /content. You can check us out. You can look us up on YouTube and stuff like that. All that stuff is there too. Mike's going to be on tomorrow night with another very interesting episode on the late night. Bobby Bishop is a family therapist, also a musician, an old friend of Mike's. That's going to be a good conversation. Of course, we'll be back Sunday morning. So thank you very much for watching.